In this video, I want to go over how you can use CalculateTable in order to create calculated tables in order to visualize how you're creating your measure. In another video, I want to create a measure that will calculate a maximum value, which takes into account which months I've selected on my slicer, but ignores my department. Because this is a multi-step process, I want to first visualize that in a calculated table to visualize each step and to see if I'm doing it correctly. To begin with, I have my table here where I have months and departments and sales. And because I'm a little lazy, I've mostly made one row per combination. But for January and Department A, I have 2 rows. And for February and Department A, I also have 2 rows. Which means the first step in my calculated table is to first summarize this table to cut it down to the unique combinations between months and department, and then summarize the sales column. The first thing I want to do is to add a measure to do the sales summary, because this is now a measure, which means that there's an implicit calculate once I do my add columns, which will avoid having to manually add in calculate. And then create a new table. And I want to use 2 measures to create this table, one being cross join and one being summarize, just to get some more practice and to show how to use this calculate table feature when you create a table. I'll start out with cross join because it's simpler and only includes one calculate table function. I want to start out doing a cross join between all of my unique values in my month column. And then in this specific case, I want to ignore any filter applied on my department, which means I don't want to use values. I want to use all to grab the table of the department column, which means I'm converting the department column into a table and ignoring any filter placed upon it. I should remember to use my variables and say this would be my cross join. At this point, I then need to add my new column, which would be my sum of sales. And as you can see already, I have 8 rows, whereas in the T-bill sales, I have 10 rows, which means these two have correctly been summarized. So I want to add columns to this table, which is now a variable being summarized month. And the column I want to add is simply sum of sales. And as I mentioned, I made this a measure, which means I don't have to wrap the calculation in calculate in order to do my context transition, which means I now have this column. And actually I was a bit hasty here because the whole point is I wanted to visualize the process, which I'm spoiling things a little by already using all, so let's use values instead. And nothing has changed right now because this calculated table has no outside filters placed upon it. Because this filter isn't going to propagate into a calculated table because there are no relationships between them. But I can do that with CalculateTable, which is the point of this video. So I now have values and I can then say I want to apply a filter, and here I'm using then CalculateTable. So I want to evaluate my table called added sales in a context where I've changed the department to be equal to B. The trouble with using variables here is that this table has already been calculated, which means this isn't being properly filtered, which means I actually can't do it this way, or at least I'm sure there is a way to do it, but I don't know how to do it, which means I need to add it up here. So I want to create some line breaks, which will make it easier to comment out my code in the future, because this is simply temporary. So I want to use CalculateTable to apply a filter, and my table is then the cross join, and I don't want to do indentation because again, this is temporary. And that's also why I'm putting the comma down here to make it easier to comment out. As I did just before here, I want to apply this as my filter, which means I only care about the B department. And then it would help if I also change this. As I said, I already spoiled the solution here because I do want my filter to propagate from the month into my calculation, that is my measure. I do want to use values here because that means then when I select a month, January, that will propagate into my measure. But I don't want that to happen with department because I do want to find the absolute highest value given the month, which means when you select A and when you select B, the y-axis will not be affected by any filter applied on department. And that's what I want to happen, which means that this is not what I want to happen. I actually want this calculate table to do nothing. And again, I spoiled it by saying that the solution is to use all, because this calculate table is then simulating applying a filter in this slicer. And because I'm using all, I'm saying I don't care about any filter applied externally, which means this filter is never applied and I get this column. And that was the cross-join-method, which is simpler because I only need one calculate table, but I need 2 when I do the summarize method. I likewise want to start out with a variable, and this also needs to start with calculate, but I'm going to skip that right now. I want to summarize my TBL sales based on both month and department in order to get all the unique combinations. And this is as expected. And then upon this table, I want to add a new column, and I'm going to keep it in one variable just to make it simpler. And likewise, there are the 8 rows I expect to get, so nothing has changed yet. I can then add my calculate table, which again is going to simulate my filter. Because I do want filters for months to propagate through, I can test that first, which means I now want to say that my calendar month, actually I can't use that column because there are no relationships. So I need to use the local column from month. But you could do this in the final measure because there will be a relationship. But now I need this TBL sales month. And we'll say that this should be equal to February. And this again is what I want to happen, so there's no surprise here. And then I can comment that out. But I don't want anything to happen when I select department, so when I do that, nothing should happen. I should both see A and B, but of course I haven't changed the construction of the table here. And the trick here was that I actually need a second layer of calculate table. So not this outer layer, which is simply done to simulate a filter. I need to actually apply a filter to the table itself. So I will say calculate this table. And then the filter I want to apply is that I want to ignore any filter applied to the department column, which as we know is all. So I can say department, and then I think I need an extra parentheses. And now nothing will happen. This filter isn't applied because I've specifically said that this table should ignore any filter. So I have an inner table which generates my summarize. Then I have this medium table, so to speak, which is then saying calculate this table, but ignore any filter that comes from outside and affects the department column. And then I have my outer calculate table, which is simulating a filter applied to department. But because this inner calculate is saying, hey, ignore anything applied to department, this doesn't go through. And I'll follow up in video 56 to show how I then calculate my final measure, which will do what I've described here to make the y-axis be independent of whether I select department. So yep,